Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am Interim Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Today, we are joined by 3 scholars who are uncovering histories about the segregation of Mexican American school children in different parts of the United States. This is undertold history, and we are grateful to our panelists for doing the scholarly work they are doing so that we, the public, can know more about our own histories. So tonight's speakers are Laura K. Muñoz, Assistant Professor of History and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Laura will be telling us about her work on Mexican Arizona and the politics of educational equality. Next up, we will have Gonzalo Guzmán, Visiting Assistant Professor at Colgate University. He will be sharing about his work on the segregation of Mexican American students in Wyoming. And finally, we have Philis Barragán, Assistant Professor of History at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. She will be sharing with us the history and role of escuelitas, or community schools, in the era of school segregation. So I would like to turn it over to Dr. Muñoz.
Thank you, Dr. Gould. I appreciate your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's super exciting to be here. In advance of our talk, I'd just like to make a brief acknowledgement and state or ask you to consider that we're joining you today from various points across the United States, and I myself am joining you from Lincoln, Nebraska, where I teach at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And Lincoln, Nebraska is a land-grant institution with campuses and programs on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Otoe, Missouri, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kaw peoples, as well as the relocated Ho-Chunk, Iowa, Sac, and Fox peoples. I'd like you to take a moment to consider the legacies of more than 150 years of displacement, violence, settlement, and survival that brings us together here today. Given that, I'd like to also begin by discussing with you my own work that takes up these questions of settlement and survival in a place known for being a rough and tumble space, the state of Arizona. So I'm going to jump now to my PowerPoint slide and let you know a little bit about my project. It's called Desert Dreams, Mexican Arizona and the Politics of Educational Equality. And I've been working on this project for a very long time, since I finished my PhD. But what it has been a pleasure to do is to recover the histories and stories of Mexican American peoples across the Southwest who've been looking at this question of education and educational achievement and educational equality for over 100 years. And so I'd like to take you a little bit back in time to start this conversation. I want to introduce you first to my inspiration. I'm trying to click through here. How do I move to the next slide, Sarah?
It should work just like with your spacebar or your arrow button, the same way. No?
Okay. I'm on the screen and I can't seem to move it. Could you do it?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
It's sharing your screen.
All right, let me click over here. How's that? Did that move at all for you?
You got it.
All right, awesome. So I've been inspired to look at this question of Mexican American educational achievement by considering my own family history. Like many of you, I come from a Latino community, a Mexican American community specifically. My community happens to be in South Texas. I was born and raised there. My great-grandmother, Maria Valdez Cantu, was a school teacher in the early 1900s. And learning about her history as a young person in inspired me to consider these questions of Mexican American education. How was it that she was able to be educated, but her own children weren't able to take advantage of some of the promise of education? How was it that her grandchildren and great-grandchildren have these mixed schooling experiences where some of us can speak Spanish, some of us can speak mostly English, some of us speak a variation of Spanglish? How is it that we've all had these differing educational experiences? So Maria's experience as a teacher raised these questions for me as I began to study the educational experience of Mexican American peoples in the United States. In Arizona in particular, this question is framed around what we call today Juan Crow, or the idea that racial segregation existed in the American Southwest, and it existed beyond the scope of Black and white as we know it. Most of you might be familiar with the idea of Jim Crow, that the racial segregation of whites and Blacks in American society was demarcated by a series of laws that were known as Jim Crow laws that mandated the separation and segregation of Blacks and whites, particularly in the U.S. South. But these laws moved with people. As whites and Anglos moved into the American Southwest, they brought these ideas of segregation with them, and they literally transplanted them onto peoples in those regions. So Mexican people of Mexican heritage living in places like Arizona, began to experience forms of Jim Crow, which we now in the present call Juan Crow. Historians like to play with that pun. Sometimes it's known as James Crow, but in this case, I'm using the idea of Juan Crow. So the racial script, as you all might understand it, means that there are places and spaces where Mexicans are defined and are expected to behave in certain ways. And so racial scripts then in Arizona played out in a number of different ways. And if we look at the way these racial scripts played out in school, and we consider the experience of the young people that you see here on the screen, the Muñoz sisters, who are standing with their father, the Reverend Esau Perez Muñoz, who was a well-known preacher in Tempe, Arizona, we can begin to understand how racial scripts unfolded in public schools. Elizabeth, who you see here on the far right, attended a range of schools in Arizona because her father moved from community to community as he was assigned by the Methodist Church to preach to Mexican communities. And so in different towns, she experienced different types of racial scripts. In the town of Miami, well-known copper mining town, children were mixed in the school. So she participated in classrooms where there were mixed Anglo and Mexican schools. When she moved to the town of Tempe, which was near Phoenix, Arizona, the schools were designated as all Mexican schools. So she attended Mexican schools solely for Mexican American children in the town of Tempe, and also in another mining community known as Sonora Reid. The town had two names. One name for the Mexicans, Sonora, and another name for the whites, or immigrant Anglos, immigrant whites, immigrant Europeans in that community lived in the side of the mine called Reid. And finally, she also integrated schools in places like Phoenix, attending an all Anglo sixth grade class. Because of her academic achievement, she was able to, according to the teachers, speak enough English to be allowed to matriculate into a classroom with predominantly Anglo students. Eventually, she and her sisters, along with her brothers, there are 6 of them in total, will attend Phoenix Union High School in Phoenix, Arizona in the 1930s. And this school also operated along the lines of racial scripts, separating children by race. There was a colored high school within the Phoenix Union High School that African American children attended. This state actually had in place Jim Crow laws that separated Black children in separate public schools, but it didn't have a similar law for Mexican American youth. And so Mexican American children who could get around the questions of language, who learned enough English at home, who succeeded in public schools, beyond the 8th grade could find themselves matriculated into the local high school. And of course, because Reverend Esau Perez Muñoz himself had graduated from college, he took a very keen interest, along with his wife, who was also college educated and a minister. The two of them together very carefully monitored their children's movement into the public schools and within Phoenix Union High School, where they completed what was known as both vocational training as well as the college track well into their high school curriculums. And in fact, the sisters did quite well in college. One of them was a valedictorian, and all of them went on to attend Phoenix Junior College and eventually Arizona State Teachers College, which today is known as Arizona State University in the town of Tempe. So this kind of gives you sort of a preview of the kind of racialization that takes place in the state of Arizona in this time period. I want to point out for you a number of dates to give you a framework for thinking about Mexican schooling in Arizona in the early 20th century. And I put this in reverse chronological order so that you have a sense of how long Mexican Americans were raising questions and actively taking political and legal action to change Mexican American segregation in public schools in the state of Arizona. The victory comes in 1951, and I use this as a touchstone because it's important, this particular case, Gonzales v. Sheely, for two reasons. One is that it is tied to two other important federal cases, Mendez versus Westminster in California, which is the first federal case filed by Mexican American parents that begins to shift the law around segregation. And that case argues that children cannot be segregated on the basis of language. Under the 14th Amendment, they're not being treated equally under the law. And the Gonzales case in Arizona uses that particular finding to argue, in this instance, for the Gonzales family and a group of 300 children in Tolleson, Arizona, and they successfully win that case. And then this case becomes a predicate to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So Arizona plays a key role in ending school segregation for children of color across the United States with the intervention that Gonzales poses. The second reason I think it's critically important is that it shows us this much longer history of challenges to Mexican American school segregation. So I want to give you a quick tour going back from 1951 and Gonzales versus Sheely to some other efforts that Mexican American parents, students, and teachers engaged in over the course of 25 years prior to what we think of as the end of Mexican American school segregation in the state of Arizona. So Gonzales v. Sheely. This case is brought forward by a group of attorneys who are representing not only the schools, but the Alianza Hispano-Americano. And this particular group will eventually become known as a civil rights organization, but it was first known in Arizona as a mutual aid society, as an insurance group that provided death benefits to Mexican American families across the entire state, and in fact across the American Southwest and parts of northern Mexico. The organization was founded in the 1890s by Tucson Mexicans who were very concerned about the encroachment of Anglo-Americans into Arizona, and of course their own loss of political and legal rights within the state. And so the Alianza becomes an organization that bands together Mexican Americans across the state of Arizona as well as the Southwest over the early 20th century. By the 1950s, the Alianza is represented by a group of attorneys. And one of these attorneys is this gentleman you see here in the center, Ralph Estrada. And Ralph Estrada becomes, here he is right here, becomes critically important because he brings the Alianza in line with a number of other civil rights groups across the United States. And those groups are represented by some of the individuals you see on the screen here. This particular gentleman up front, Gus Garcia, well-known attorney who worked for the American GI Forum and the League of United Latin American Citizens and fought and filed as a legal representative some of the first cases around Mexican American civil rights. In addition, the Alianza joins the American Council of Spanish-Speaking Peoples, led by the very well-known Dr. George Sanchez from the University of Texas at Austin, who was also raising these questions as an intellectual and as a civil rights activist. And the Alianza also joined hands with the Los Angeles-based Community Service Organization, which was also looking at issues related to Mexican American civil rights across the board. So the Alianza's legal work in this particular instance leads to the Gonzales v. Chile victory. And this victory, in fact, is tied to a whole series of other lawsuits that the Alianza will file in this time period, including cases known as Ortiz v. Jack in 1951 that becomes the death knell in the state of Arizona for ending Mexican American school segregation. Glendale, this particular case, Ortiz versus Jack, is also filed in a federal court, and it incorporates all of the public school districts that segregate Mexican children. And so in the case of Tolleson, which is a one school district case, that particular community wins its desegregation case, but then Estrada and the Alianza go and attack the rest of the state, and they're successful in Ortiz v. Jack. They're successful in a swimming pool case of desegregation in Baca v. Winslow in Winslow, Arizona, and also in another case in California known as Romero versus Weekly. So the Alianza and Gonzales v. Chile began to demonstrate for us that Arizonans or Arizonenses, Mexican Arizonans, are critically thinking about race, segregation, and Mexican American equality in this particular time period. I'm going to quickly go down a few more slides. I know I'm pressing for time here, and Sara, I hope you'll give me a cue if I need to move on. But I want to introduce you some other actors who are very active in Mexican American civil rights. You know, when Estrada and the Alianza introduced this idea of desegregating the public schools in the 1950s, they were really building on a much longer history. And in the 1930s and 1940s, just before World War I, a group of young students known as Los Conquistadores at Arizona State Teachers College also began raising questions about Mexican American student success. And they formed what is known as the very first Mexican American civil rights group at Tempe, at Arizona State Teachers College, now today known as ASU, in 1938. This is the first sort of race-based Mexican club established by Mexican American future teachers who are asking questions about the condition of Mexican American children. The organization starts out initially as a group of men, but quickly becomes a co-ed organization. And you'll notice that I've highlighted or circled a couple of the figures here, and these are Rebecca Muñoz and her siblings, who by then have matriculated to Arizona State Teachers College and are fundamentally the founders of this particular organization. They held important meetings. This is an example of a student group of Los Conquis meeting with the ASU president, Grady Gamage. And also this particular breakfast was a precursor to meetings that they hosted annually with the Mexican American student movement in Southern California. They held Mexican youth conferences beginning in 1938, 39, 40, and 41 to tackle this question from a regional level. What do we do to begin to educate Mexican American children, to encourage them to pursue higher education, to encourage them to persist in the midst of segregated schooling? That's Grady Gamage, that's Ross Muñoz Sr. They also aligned themselves with other organizations in the state that were raising questions about Mexican American civil rights, like the Latin American Club that you see here that met in 1938 in Phoenix. The Latin American Club had a club in every single town in the state of Arizona in this time period. All of the parents in that organization are addressing questions of Mexican American civil rights, including Mexican American educational rights. So we're talking here about a very statewide prescient issue that Mexican Americans are confronting in the time period. We also have examples of Mexican Americans beginning to promote legislation and resolutions to change segregation in the public schools. This is an example from Jimmy Carrion, one of the first Mexican Americans elected to the Arizona legislature from Phoenix, and he calls upon the Arizona Educators Association to challenge Mexican segregation in the schools and to literally end the separation of Mexican children in public schools in the state. He brings this particular resolution to the Mexican Youth Conference, also held in December 1941 at Arizona State. And unfortunately, the conference takes place on the very same day that the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, becomes in essence the day that the efforts to end discrimination in Mexican schools for Mexican Americans in the state of Arizona also ends. Because at this point, everyone's going to turn their focus to World War II. And that's why there's such a huge gap between the actions of these youth in the late 1930s and Carrion in 1941, and that leap to 51 and 52 when the Alianza is working to finally end Mexican school segregation, because their efforts in the 30s and 40s are interrupted not only by the Great Depression, but then by World War II. Prior to that, in 1925, there was another case, and this case is what led me to really sort of study the question of segregation of school children in Arizona. And this is a case known as Romo versus Laird. In this case, the two parents that you see here, Joaquina Romo and her husband, Bebe, who's seated here, challenged the local school district in Tempe, Arizona. They file a court case in Maricopa County, demanding that their children be integrated into what's known as the American school. And the case raises a lot of questions about nationality. Are Mexican children U.S. citizens? Do they belong to the U.S. nation? Or does their heritage deem that they're children of the Mexican nation? Does their language factor into whether or not they should be trained in Mexican schools where they can learn to speak English, or whether they should be integrated in American schools with children from their own neighborhoods who are also learning how to speak, read, and write English at the same time? So the Romo's case is important because it raises this question for the first time in a superior court within the state. The case gets a lot of press. The Arizona county attorneys in Maricopa are very afraid that the Romos, if they do not win their case, will take it to the Arizona Supreme Court. And it's a fear that the Arizona Supreme Court might actually rule in their favor. And that fear that they might win this case is what drives the local school district and eventually the Maricopa County attorney to convince the Tempe Public Schools to accept the Romo children and other children of Mexican heritage into its local public schools. So while there is actually a segregated Mexican school in the town of Tempe in existence from 1925, when this case was filed, well into the 1940s, select children of Mexican American heritage, presumably those of the middle class, are allowed to enroll in Tempe public schools and attend classes with what we think of as Anglo-American or white children in this local school district. So the Romo case introduces us to sort of those predicaments, the ways that we can move around racial scripts to engage aspects of equality in a local community. In this case, the Romos embrace the notion of their own middle class position, also their own European heritage as a mixed race people. The fact that they could both speak English and Spanish, and their children could too, created opportunities for them to move around racial scripts that other Mexicans who might be immigrant, who might be Spanish language dominant, would not have been able to in the exact same time period. And they're doing this in a community that is clearly aware of the racial scripts that are in play and clearly aware of the dynamics of race when it comes to what it means to be white, what it means to be Black, and ultimately what it means to be Mexican and Mexican American in the state of Arizona. Thank you all for your time. couple of examples of segregation in the state of Arizona. But lastly, my gratefulness to MACRI, to the Mexican American Civil Rights Initiative, and to SADA for this opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you so much.
Can you all see the screen, this map?
And there we go, Dr. Guzmán, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you all hear me too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. First of all, I'm like bugging out right now. Like, just being on a panel with Philis, Laura, who's a mentor of mine, and Philis, like, your book is amazing, getting tons of reviews. I'm just like, being star-studded right now. So it's such a pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. Yeah. So I just want to remind people where Wyoming is. And just sort of because we just heard from Arizona and then we'll hear from Texas. But the reason why I'm doing this is because when we talk about Wyoming, we mostly talk about its landscape and geography, not its social history, particularly regarding its social history regarding race.
Mm-hmm.
And although my focus will be on Wyoming, really my book manuscript does talk about Colorado, Nebraska, and Montana. Actually, all the places you see on the map are all places where segregated Mexican schools or rooms were actually created.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Laura, Scottsbluff, that entire county has some stuff going on.
Yes.
All right. So, but first of all, I mean, I just moved to New York from Seattle. I grew up in the Yakima Valley of Washington State. For those of you from the Valley, I love you. Hey, Mom. But like, why Wyoming? And this is why Wyoming. What you see before you is a ID card that was given to my great grandfather. Yeah. Who went through El Paso, Texas in 1919, and he was recruited by the Wyoming Sugar Company to go straight to Worland, Wyoming, that in 1936 would create a Mexican school. They got the money to do it with New Deal relief. It was a federal project. I'll talk more about that. And so, I like showing this because the reason why we were in Wyoming is because we were brought to Wyoming. That's why. And recruited, and the same goes for Montana, Nebraska, and certain regions of Colorado. But the reason why I bring up, this picture is in also echoing what Laura says, is that there's a very deep personal connection with this. When I started out my graduate research, actually what I wanted to do was the educational histories of the ethnic Mexican community in Washington State, particularly the Yakima County. However, when I started doing this research in my own personal narrative, I figured out that a large number of migrants, Latinx migrants, who came to Washington State and sort of started the first settlements in Washington State of the Latinx community actually came from Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, not the Southwest and not from Mexico. So, in other words, the research led me there, and also my family narrative led me there. Before I move on from this picture, which, by the way, I found randomly off Ancestry.com, like nobody in my family had this.
Wow.
So this is like one of the first times that we've ever seen this photo of my great grandfather. So this speaks to how so much of this history, archival, has sort of been hidden from us, and why it's so important that we're doing this work. That's why I'm bugging out, because of the great history we're sharing together, because it's so powerful. So thank you all.
Mhm.
And so I'm specifically going to talk about the community that my great grandfather was recruited to, and then we ended up leaving in the 1940s to go to Washington State. So what you see before you is actually a photo that's taken in 1932, and I believe, and this is in Worland, Wyoming, and I believe this is either a third or fourth grade classroom.
Mhm.
However, what I want you all to pay attention to is that it is racially integrated. There are children here who are Mexican descent. There are Japanese children in here. There are white children. And there are also children who were called German Russians in this community, who were a identifiable white ethnic group, who actually were not considered to be fully white at the time. They will be considered fully white when they segregate Mexican children. However, the reason why Worland, Wyoming, and I'll talk about Torrington later, is important is because it's one of those few times where we can look at the very moment in which segregation takes place. And what happened to make that happen. And here you go. So this is a photo that is taken in back of the segregated Mexican school in Worland, Wyoming. Although this picture is taken from 1946, and you see a picture of a segregated Mexican classroom, this building, which by the way still exists in Worland, Wyoming, intact by the way, it's not in use, but it's a bank now. It's a car dealership now, by the way. They were really shocked when I told them what it used to be. But the reason why I bring this up is because this was a New Deal project. Wyoming applied for a federal grant, a state grant, and even in the federal grant, they ask, why do you want this money? And under justification, they put explicitly, it's socially desirable to segregate white and Mexican children. Let me repeat, that was the only reason why they got money to build this school. And this got federal approval, state approval. It was statewide news. It was even news in Billings, Montana, that they were reporting about this school. Like, look what this community is doing for its Mexican children. And what's important about this is that this school is central in creating racial lines in this community. Like I talked about in that picture you just saw in 1932, there was a very, very heated debate about the racial status, not of just Mexican children, but of these European ethnic community called German Russians, who also worked in agriculture, by the way, the sugar beet industry. And it wasn't until this school was built in the community that the questions answered. Mexicans are non-white, German Russians are white. And you know how we know? They don't have to go to this school. What's also interesting about this school in Wyoming is that there are also reported cases that the small amount of Black children in this community were also forced to go to the school as well. So going back to the discussion of racial scripts, of the ways in which certain racial groups are clumped together, compared together, related to each other. Before I move on to the other school, this recently got approved to be part of the National Register of Historic Places as part of the National Park Service. And the reason why this is interesting, because the only other places that this has happened, there are like 2 schools in Texas, and the other one is in Arizona.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if this was planned, Sarah, but this is kind of serendipity that the only places that have national recognition of regarding these institutions about segregation are Wyoming now, Texas, and Arizona. But the fact that there's only 4 and only 2 of them are intact speaks to how much work needs to be done. So I hope this inspires someone to go and look and do that research, because it's necessary. No way are these the only places where this exists. I just showed you that map.
Mm-hmm.
And here's another school which is on the border of Nebraska, and it's called the Columbia School for Spanish American Pupils. And this is actually a big spot in the newspaper in 1943 as part of a Victory for All campaign during World War II in this community. They're telling the world how special they are and how united they are. And here's an example. What's interesting about this, you also see how the Wyoming community starts changing the way they talk about Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. Now they're starting to call them Spanish Americans, where they never did before. And they also changed the name of the school. So in 1943, the Mexican American community says, this is enough. We're not going to do this. We want to go to any school that we want to. And so they do a boycott. They're saying, we're not going to attend any school unless you allow us to attend the city schools. What's interesting about this school is that in 1929, this school actually was built, but it wasn't built just for Mexican children. It was built for children who worked in agriculture, specifically the sugar beet industry in 1929 for German, Russian, and Mexican children. In 1929, the German Russians do their own walkout and say, we're not going to attend any school if you make us go to school with Mexican children. The superintendent in 1929 says, okay, we'll let the German Russians come. It becomes a segregated Mexican school. In 43, Mexican parents do the same thing. And the school board doesn't fully oblige, but they say, we'll change the name to the Columbia School instead of the Mexican school. And they do allow a number of Mexican children to start going into the public schools. I just think it's interesting that this was part of the public newspaper, like promoting it. It was something special. And I'll end my talk with the discussion of what's interesting about Wyoming is how many similarities and dissimilarities it has with other regions. Like if you read the work of David G. Garcia and his discussion of Oxnard, it's unbelievable the parallels that there is. It's like, were these white educators, where was the group chat? Where was the message board where they were communicating with each other on how to segregate? Because it's really eerie how similar they are. And it's like, what's going on here? But I will also end with this, though. So by 1956, so in 1955, Wyoming repealed its permissive segregation law that only allowed the segregation of Black children. And then, it's post Brown v. Board 54 and 55. However, by 1956, the segregation of Mexican children in the state is almost a moot issue. Also, even in Billings, Montana, by 1943, the Mexican school is not even in use anymore. And in the case of Wyoming, what the Mexican community does is they just bounce. They leave. They use their feet as a form of activism. And one of doing oral histories and talking with my family about this, one of the major reason why they decide to stay in Washington State is at least our children weren't segregated in Washington State. Yeah, there was still discrimination, but they could still go to any school that they wanted to. So not only does this expand Latinidad to the Pacific Northwest, for instance, they go to Yakima County, Washington, that just flipped in 2020 to a majority non-white county, mostly Latinx, and also the Yakima Nation is there. The origin of this is an educational narrative. It's an educational migration story where they said enough is enough. If you don't want us, we're gone. We don't need to deal with this. And they didn't. And that's why I'm here today. I am part of that educational narrative, now speaking back to this history. So hopefully you find Wyoming more interesting now. There you go.
Wow, what a story. Okay, I would like to invite Philis to share about escuelitas.
Yes, hi everyone. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. And can you all see my screen?
Mhm.
There it is. Yes, thank you.
Yay.
Yay, yes, it worked. So hi everyone. I want to start by saying thank you so much to MACRI and to Dr. Saragul and to everyone involved in organizing this event tonight. And I really want to say thank you to my fellow panelists. You guys are great. Those presentations were awesome. And I'm super excited and honored to be here with you guys today.
Love you, Philis.
Thank you. So, like an interesting side note, like my fellow panelists, my family history also very much connects to my research.
Mm-hmm.
And I reference my grandmother and my great grandmother in various chapters in my book because they both attended escuelitas. And my great grandmother attended one, and then she kind of had one for her children that my grandmother attended. So my work focuses on the history of escuelitas in South Texas as a way to better understand Mexican Americans' longstanding relationship to education. And one of the most important dimensions that appeared in my research as I was going through the process, and something that'll be a thread throughout this presentation, is that escuelita history also helps us better understand the different ways that ethnic Mexican women were leaders in their communities. So translating to little schools, the term escuelita refers to a broad base of community schools that could be both formal and informal. So informal escuelitas, they could take place in someone's living room where someone would open up their home to neighborhood children, parents would pay a small fee. And then formal escuelitas had their own building. And in those cases, typically what happened was members of the ethnic Mexican community, they pooled their time, their money, their resources, and their labor to construct a building and then to maintain it. So here's a photo of one such example of a formal escuelita. It's Colegio Altamirano in Hebronville. And I'm going to talk more about this escuelita in a bit. So a big part of my work, a big part of my argument for it is that the existence of escuelitas, how do we interpret them? How do we analyze them? How can we think about them? That it points to two things. So one is that Mexican Americans had profound respect for education, right? And they have for centuries. And two, that Mexican Americans used education, but even more specifically escuelitas, as a vehicle to negotiate their lives in the United States. And so escuelitas did not exist in a vacuum. And by that, I mean that they were very much impacted by the larger historical developments that occurred over time. And so two of those historical developments, two of the most influential ones on escuelita history that I want to talk about are the creation of a public school system in Texas, and then the rise of the progressive education movement, which is what shaped the ideological foundation of the public school system. So public schooling in Texas has its origins in the school law of 1854, and basically what that law did was it created a permanent school fund that was supposed to subsidize the construction of school buildings. But by 1862, a year after the Civil War started, all of the money, the $2 million that went into this school fund as a result of the law, all of that money was gone. It had been lent, and I use that in quotes, right? Lent to railroad companies or given to the Confederacy. And so as such, you get to the 1870s, and there's like less than 5 schools across the state of Texas that could be considered public schools. And so the state doesn't begin to fund the building of more schools until the mid-1880s. So the progressive movement then had a huge impact on the public school system at this moment when it's starting to expand and develop, because social, educational, and political reform were some of the movement's key objectives. But progressive reformers did all of this. Like, it sounds great in theory, like on the surface, right? It sounds amazing. But progressive reformers, they carried out all of their reform with this single-mindedness that was outright discriminatory against poor and working class people of color, because these reformers were so heavily influenced by xenophobic, nativist, and racist ideals. So linking it back, like, how does this affect education in Texas, right? So the progressive education movement began in Texas in 1884 and lasted till about 1940. And so in 1884, that's the first year that the state legislature passes its first English-only law for public education. And along with those English-only policies came changes to the curriculum and a rise in segregation. And it's not like these progressives are really trying to justify segregation, making the argument that ethnic Mexican children were culturally and intellectually inferior, and that because of that, they needed to be segregated, right? They were segregated based on their educational needs. And so segregating children based on these educational needs is called pedagogical segregation. And so, like, here's how it worked. Segregation of African Americans was written into the 1876 Texas State Constitution, which stated that there needed to be two public school systems, one for white children and one for Black children. But since Mexican Americans were legally considered white, then they could not be segregated based on race, right? So where do they fit into these two different public school systems? But they were segregated across the United States for what school officials claimed were their educational needs. So pedagogical segregation then served as a cloak for race-based segregation. And so part of the argument for pedagogical segregation was that it was in the best interest of all children to segregate them, right? And for reasons that I kind of already said, like Mexican Americans, they don't speak English. They don't know what it means to be American. They're not that smart, et cetera, et cetera. And so the reality, though, is that no one ever tested these children to assess their English language skills or to assess any of their skills. So these ideas about Mexican and Mexican American children, it gave way then to, as I said earlier, an Americanization curriculum that was centered on monolingualism, English literacy, vocational and industrial training, and Anglo-centric historical narratives. And so here's a photo that George Sanchez, that Laura referenced, she referenced him in her presentation. He was a professor at UT Austin, and in 1946, he took on this project where he drove around South Texas. He visited 10 different school districts, and he took photographs, and he looked at school records, attendance records, grade sheets, things like that. And so this is a photograph that he took of the Mexican Ward School in Mathis, Texas. And along the left there you see is his caption, right? It's dilapidated, inadequate. It's a rotting old shack. There's no fly proofing, no rat proofing. And he also took pictures of the privy, the outhouse that went to this school, because there was no indoor plumbing. Now, despite the intellectual and the cultural violence that the Texas public school system imposed on Mexican and Mexican American children, ethnic Mexicans resisted these demands to abandon their language and their culture. And one of the tactics that they used was founding escuelitas throughout South Texas. And in these spaces that they created, the curriculum focused on Mexican history and cultural traditions, literature and poetry, and Spanish was always the language of instruction. So this map plots all the locations of escuelitas for which I was able to find concrete evidence. So there's a couple of things that I want to note about this map. The first one is that I found a number of documents that said things like escuelitas exist in every pocket of South Texas, right? So I'm pretty positive that there should be dots across the entirety of South Texas, but as a historian, you're tied to your evidence, and I could only put a dot where a specific location was named. And the second thing I want to note is that while there's only one dot per place, there's so much evidence that there were many escuelitas in any particular city at any given point in time over a period of several decades. So, for example, in 1842, the superintendent of public instruction in Laredo complained in his annual report that there were about 40 escuelitas throughout the city, and that the ethnic Mexicans in Laredo were sending their children to those schools instead of to the public school, and that's why attendance was low. Now, the most famous escuelita in Texas was called El Colegio Altamirano, which opened sometime in the 1890s in Hebronville in Duval County. And it was in Duval County at that time, but today Hebronville is in Jim-Hog County. So in 1895, Duval County it was about 1,800 square miles in size, but it only had 18 public schools, and only one of them was a high school, and all of the rest were ungraded. So in the face of the utter lack of educational opportunity, members of the ethnic Mexican community in Hebronville, they pooled their resources, they built their own schoolhouse, and they hired a teacher from Mexico. So this photo is from 1911, and the teacher seated here is Amelia Davila, and she taught at El Colegio from 1910 to 1916, and then again from 1930 to 1955. And she's about 26 when this photo was taken. So Davila was born in 1885 in Saltillo, Coahuila, and she was a graduate of the Teachers College there. And La Prensa reported that she was, quote, a true intellectual mother for the children of Hebronville. She taught 6 different grades in multiple subjects. The only textbook she used was a book of poetry, and students, they studied, they memorized, and then they recited these poems at like end of the year oral exams and school festivals. She taught a long list of subjects. I'm going to list some for you here. Lengua Nacional, which was Spanish, math, natural science, history, drawing, calligraphy, singing, manual trades, physical exercise, geography, and science. She gave passionate lectures on Mexican history, and the community provided her with other teaching materials, like the local butcher donated a cow's eye that she used to lecture on the anatomy of the eye. And throughout the school year, she used oral exams to assess her students' abilities. It became really common for students of El Colegio to transfer to the public school system for junior high school. And the president of the Hebronville Independent School District noted in one of his reports that students who transferred from El Colegio were, and I'm quoting him here, were more regular in attendance, more obedient, and more capable of grasping the English language than those who have not had this training, end quote. So I want to take a moment here. I want to point out that some of what I found and shared about El Colegio and Emilia Davila came from historical articles in the Spanish language press, census records, vital records, other genealogical research. But most of it came from the personal papers of a woman named Rosa Lidia Vasquez. I met Rosa Lidia in the summer of 2018, and after I drove to Hebronville to see the building where El Colegio was located. The building still stands, by the way. And I met with some members of the board of the Museum Foundation of Hebronville. And while I was there, the board members connected me to Rosa Lidia. And I called her up. We made an appointment to meet. I was anticipating that she was going to live on some remote ranch in South Texas. And it turns out she lived less than a mile away from my house in San Antonio. So it was meant to be, I think, for her and I to meet. She was a second generation Colegio Altamirano graduate. Both she and her mother went there, and both of them studied with Emilia Davila. And in fact, her mother, Delia Vela, is pictured right here at the bottom left with the braids and the bows. Now, Rosa Lidia attended El Colegio through the 4th grade, and then she transferred to the public school system. And when she transferred, she was placed in 3rd grade because she didn't speak English. And she moved through the grades quickly as she learned the language. And when she graduated high school, she was valedictorian and her sister was salutatorian. So much of the history of El Colegio's curriculum, of its routine, of the significance of this escuelita would have been lost if not for the personal archives of Rosa Lidia, who died quite suddenly at the end of 2019. And the cover of my book is a photo from her collection, by the way. So saving family archives is an act of resistance that is integral to uncovering ethnic Mexican history. Like Hebronville, Laredo also has a long escuelita history. So in September of that's a picture of me and Rosa Lidia together in one of our many meetings at her house. So like Hebronville, Laredo also has a long escuelita history. In September of 1911, the Idar family, a prominent family in Laredo, published their own Spanish language newspaper called La Crónica. They hosted what they called El Primer Congreso Mexicanista to discuss the rampant violence and discrimination against ethnic Mexicans in Texas. Now, during the conference, Texas Mexican women also organized themselves into their own charitable group called La Liga Mexicanista, or the Mexican Women's League. And their main objective was the education of Texas Mexican children. So these women believed that widespread poverty and illiteracy were one of the most pressing problems for their community. Jovita Idar, pictured here, she was president of La Liga, wrote that, the US and Mexico, neither of them are going to do anything to educate our children. We have to do it ourselves, right? So I want to share with you some information about one of these women, Maria Renteria, who in 1911, she was 18 years old. She had moved to Laredo and was elected treasurer, as you'll see there. She graduated from Mexico City's Teacher College for Women, and she took out advertisements for her escuelita in La Crónica, stating that she taught women, Spanish literacy and arts and crafts. But she also published other articles in La Crónica, and they give us some insight into, her possible curriculum beyond arts and crafts. So 1 month after the founding of La Liga, she shared her research with her fellow Liga members and published an article based on this research in La Crónica. And her article focused on 2 women who helped Mexico win its independence from Spain. And so a line from the article talks about, in studying history, we find beautiful examples of mothers who sacrificed themselves for their children, wives who braved thousands of dangers to save their husbands and enhance their homeland, and daughters who feared nothing and challenged everything to achieve the happiness of their parents and the honor and glory for their country. And so her article not only combats stereotypes of Mexican women, but it's an early form of women's history, because it positions women as active agents and it acknowledges the value of their labor as mothers, as soldiers, and as everything in between. And so by inserting women's roles into Mexico's founding, Maria Renteria then was making a very powerful statement about the various roles that women could play in their own communities in its present and in its future. And by sharing her research, she was sending this message too, that in this time when no one else would educate their children except for these women, that they were carrying out their own revolutionary act. Now, the Mexican Revolution ended in 1920, and afterward, throughout the 20s, the Mexican consulate exerted quite a bit of energy in supporting escuelitas. And to be clear, they didn't have money to pay for schools, so they didn't do that. But it was more like, we'll send you a batch of books, and we'll attend your end-of-year festivals, and we'll make speeches, and lots of emotional support. And so here's an example of that. This is a letter from Moises Morales, who lived in Valentine, Texas. And he wrote to the Secretary of Foreign Relations in Mexico City. And his letter gives details about the curriculum and the student population of his escuelita that had 50 boys and girls in attendance. They taught them reading, writing, patriotic history, geography, geometry, and everything distinctly Mexican. And he goes on to ask, can you please send me some Mexican books that will serve as my guide in teaching my pupils? And note the date of the letter is 1927. So at the same time in this decade that the consulate is really doubling down in its support of escuelitas, Mexican American men began organizing themselves into formal civil rights organizations that really culminate in the founding of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, in 1929. And so ultimately, these Mexican American civil rights activists convince much of the population to enroll their children in the Texas public school system and to look to the United States as the foundation for their political and their civil rights. And also they convinced the Mexican consulate to, abandon their support of escuelitas and support us in our quest for educational equality. And the documents in the Mexican embassy's archive kind of point to this as well, because the last files pertaining to escuelitas in Texas are from 1927. And so this letter here is one of the last documents. And then beginning in 1930, there are quite a few documents pertaining to exclusion and segregation in Del Rio and Mission, Texas, as well as various parts of California. So to be clear then, escuelitas did not go away completely, but after World War II, you no longer see sources that state they're in every pocket of Texas, right? The Spanish language press begins to publish articles lamenting the fact that so many of these escuelitas are closing. So there's this definite connection between these school closures and the campaign for public school integration. But I argue that the escuelitas had a significant impact on this campaign for integration, on the Mexican American civil rights movement, because so many of these activists attended escuelitas in their own childhood. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. We've learned so much tonight. We have a few questions, okay? So I want to start off with Laura. Laura, you were mentioning the issue of class, particularly in regards to the Romo versus Laird case. And I'm just wondering, as you have been researching these different sort of stages for efforts to end school segregation in Arizona, what role has class played? And then also, certainly, Gonzalo and Philis, if you have thoughts about how class is playing a role in the areas that you're looking at, please feel free to chime in after Laura fills us in. Oops, I think you are muted. Hang on one second.
Okay.
I unmuted you. Go for it.
Okay. I believe class is critical in these instances. When you think about about the economy of the United States and the way it emerged as an agricultural-based economy, particularly in the Southwest, the labor that a family could perform would be greatly increased if their children were working alongside their parents. And oftentimes, particularly in the case of agriculture, cotton, and for example, citrus, for example, which were two important commodities in Arizona, parents really depended on the labor of their children. And that came into contradiction with, school regulatory laws, particularly in the progressive era, where not only is English only being promoted, but there's an expectation that all children will be in public schools, and requirements are being passed to have children in school until the age of 16, basically, until they're able to work officially as adults. But for Mexican American parents, that became a hardship. So oftentimes we saw that when parents in the town of Tempe, for example, did not actively send their children to either an escuelita or a public school, those children and the parents would often be rounded up by a local sheriff or a school officer who would come on the hunt for them and arrest the parents for failing to send their children to school. So then the parents now are dealing with fines, potential jail time, and then the children are being removed and placed back in the public schools. So class is definitely a factor, because it's only parents who can afford to send their children to school, who can afford to hire attorneys, that can afford to pursue legal solutions. Otherwise, parents have to rely on informal relations that either come through the mutual aid societies or other social, cultural groups, the church, for example, to help them sort of negotiate access to education and access to a living wage in the time period. So class is definitely critical. And it's the elite, as Philis pointed out, that will have the opportunity, because of their own financial wherewithal, to begin to address the political issues affecting the Mexican American community. So the rise of LULAC, and then later the American GI Forum, and even the civil rights initiatives sponsored by the Alianza in Arizona are really centered in a middle class aesthetic of Mexican Americans.
Do you want to say anything?
Yeah. I love everything that Laura just said, and I completely agree with all of it. In South Texas, you definitely see the impact of class manifest in, a number of different ways, some of which, first of all, when we think about public education, we always think of it as being free. And in the second half of the 19th century, public education wasn't free in Texas. Basically, the state would, like I said, would donate land and then pay for a building to be built, right, to turn it into a school. But that was it. It was up to the local community to figure out how they were going to sustain that school. And it was illegal for local communities to levy taxes in support of these schools. So oftentimes, the schools had to charge tuition. Best case scenario, best case scenario, a school would be free 4 to 5 months out of the year and then only charge tuition for the second half of the year, or vice versa, something like that. Books weren't free. Families had to buy their textbooks. So there were a number of people who, lived too far away, right? If you only have 18 schools in a county that's 1,800 square miles, chances are you don't live very close to a school. So unless you can afford for your child to live somewhere else near school, or for your family to move in an area closer to the school, chances, your kid's probably not going to attend. And then even if distance isn't an obstacle, then you still have to think about tuition and paying for books and things like that. As far as escuelitas, you see class play out also in a number of ways, because Spanish being the language of instruction and teaching Spanish literacy, there was this, and I don't think I'm overstating this, but abhorrence of Tex-Mex. And the fact that so many ethnic Mexican children spoke Tex-Mex was very troubling. Like the cohort of women teachers in Laredo, Jovita Hidar, Maria Renteria, a number of them in their writings, Leonor Villegas de Magnon, in their writings, they talk about how much they hate Tex-Mex. And part of the escuelita, it's not just, fighting against the issues in the public education system, but it's also, we need to teach them how to speak proper Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the use of Tex-Mex being associated with the working classes.
Yeah, regarding Wyoming, I think in the late 1920s, a Mexican consulate actually visited Billings, Montana, and his comment was how it was a company town, that the sugar beet industry controlled everything.
Mm-hmm.
The way to think about Wyoming is that it was a company state. And in fact, the tallest the tallest buildings in Wyoming until the 40s and 50s were actually sugar beet factory chimneys. So what I'm pointing to is the lack of class in Wyoming, or a lack of diversity that was very bound to this one industry, this one agriculture. So this explains why what happened? Oh, sorry about that.
You're good.
that was like Adobe decided that it disagreed with me. Speaking of companies, yeah. So I mean, a lot of the organizing that happened was around labor. So during the 1930s, the federal government passes a Sugar Act in 34 and in 1937. And the reason why it stands out is because it actually becomes really an act that disproportionately impacts Mexican laborers in the Mountain States because they're the ones doing the work. And they go to DC and Denver to do this. And so in terms of organizing in class, it really is bound to that one industry. And how that comes about is it actually brings in the Mexican children because so many children worked with their families that it brings the Mexican children into the New Deal. And this is the only agriculture crop that is regulated during the New Deal. Like they get rid of child labor supposedly, and they have a wage cap. So so class is there. It's just the type of class we're talking about and regarding the organization. So it does explain the different type of trajectories that happened in the 30s, particularly in World War II, where things open up in the West Coast.
Okay, question for Gonzalo. On that photo you showed us of the Spanish American school, it said Mrs. Juanita Patton. Do you know anything about her?
She's not Latina. I actually interviewed her daughter, and I have her ledger that she wrote to Stuart Jameson Marshall, who was a student of Paulus Taylor, who is an economist who wrote tons about Mexican labor in the 20s and 30s. He actually did stuff on Wyoming. He just didn't do a book about it. And I interviewed her daughter, and she said it wasn't a segregated school. And I think this speaks to these this sort of knowledge creation of the ways in which people remember racism and segregation, that even when your family participated in this, to them it wasn't segregation, right? It wasn't racism. But yeah, and she wrote a lot about her experience teaching Mexican-American children, and it was very racial paternalism, right? The white mother saving the non-white races. And what's unfortunate for the Mexican community there is that she was only the few white people that actually had regular relations with the Mexican community, and it was based on this very, very paternalistic one of saving them, without acknowledging the structures at place that was forcing segregation in the first place. She said nothing about the German-Russian community. Yeah. Okay.
Before I forget, I did just want to throw this up on the screen. Philis's book, if you were interested in learning more about escuelitas, this is her book. And of course, we're waiting for the book. I see Gonzalo's got his own copy there. But we're of course waiting for the books for Gonzalo and Laura. So when those come out, we'll invite you back, okay?
Thank you.
But Philis, I do have a question that came in from the audience. There was a question about school buildings and any school buildings that still remain. So there was a question about what's that school in Mathis that you showed the picture of, is that still there, or is the school in Hebronville still there?
Oh, the school in Mathis, I'm not sure if that's still there or not, but the building that housed El Colegio Altamirano is still there in Hebronville.
Wow, okay, field trip. Okay. Well, let me just see. I just wanted to say there are so many people saying how happy they are to have joined in tonight, to have learned from you, and how appreciative they are for your research. So I echo that. And I want to thank all of our panelists tonight. You were fantastic, and just really helped fill in some blank spots in what I think we know about the past and the way that we have been schooled, or in some cases not schooled. So I want to thank all of our audience members for joining us tonight. I also hope that you might consider joining us again next Tuesday we'll be having a virtual conversation about the use of contested iconography in sports. Our panelists will explore the history of stereotypes in sports mascots, why questions have been raised about the Eyes of Texas fight song, and what's controversial about referencing the Texas Revolution in sports teams, names, and merchandise. So that is next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. We hope you enjoyed being with us tonight, and we hope to see you again in the future. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.